New evidences on the mysterious death of John Wesley Hardin. What if the most feared gunman in Texas never saw his killer? Or what if, in his final second, he spotted a shadow in the mirror and went for his gun? One man swore it was cold murder. Another swore it was a fight for his life. The Acme Saloon in El Paso shook with one shot on a hot night in 1895. Dice were still rolling on the table when the most notorious outlaw in the West collapsed on the floor. But how that first shot was fired has been debated ever since. Was it an ambush? Was it self-defense? Or is the truth hidden somewhere in between? In this series, we will follow the clues left behind, witness stories, diagrams, and even the bullet itself. And in Part 5, you'll see how modern research uncovers answers that no one in 1895 could have imagined. Part 1. The first shot, ambush or self-defense. The killing of John Wesley Hardin in El Paso has lived for more than a century in shadow and smoke. One man swore it was murder in cold blood, while another insisted it was a desperate act of self-preservation. Yet when you trace the event back to the very first instant, the truth remains locked between two competing versions. Did Constable John Selman walk into the Acme Saloon, step up behind Hardin, and fire into his skull without a word? Or did he react to a deadly movement in those final seconds? To answer, we have to dig into what witnesses said that night, what the doctors found, and how memory and bias shaped the story that has reached us today. It was August 19th, 1895, just after 11 o'clock at night. The Acme Saloon was loud with dice games, laughter, and the clink of glasses. Hardin, once the most feared gunfighter in Texas, was leaning over the bar and rolling dice. His back was turned toward the entryway, and he was in the middle of a joke when Selman entered. Everyone agreed that what followed was fast. Within moments, Hardin slumped to the floor, shot in the back of the head. Where the debate begins is over what passed in that split second between Selman's appearance and the fall of Hardin. The most direct account held that Selman walked up behind Hardin, raised his pistol, and shot him point blank without warning. This version spread quickly through El Paso that night and was printed in several newspapers by morning. To many who had lived in fear of Hardin's reputation, the story made sense. He had killed dozens of men, he had threatened others in El Paso, and he had made enemies in law enforcement. If Selman had finally acted as executioner, plenty of locals felt it was rough justice and overdue. Yet another account told something very different. According to a gambler named Shorty Anderson, Hardin saw Selman's reflection in the long saloon mirror as he approached. Hardin, Anderson said, began to turn and reach for his pistol, forcing Selman to fire before he himself was shot. That description suggested not an ambush, but a deadly contest measured in fractions of a second. It also cast Selman not as an assassin, but as a man who beat Hardin to the draw. How do we decide between the two stories? The strongest piece of evidence is the medical testimony given that night. Doctors who examined Hardin's body reported that the fatal bullet entered the back of his head. A man turning to face his attacker should have been struck from the front or at least the side. A wound to the back of the skull makes the mirror and turn story much harder to believe. It supports the simpler account that Hardin never saw the shot coming at all. But here lies the difficulty. Witnesses do not always agree, and under the pressure of violence, they often recall what they expect rather than what they saw. In the chaos of gun smoke, shouting, and movement, Anderson may have believed Hardin was turning, or he may have invented the claim later to protect Selman's reputation. At the same time, early newspaper reports often rushed details or leaned toward the story readers wanted, which was that the feared Hardin finally met the fate he deserved. Memory and media each bent the truth in their own way. Selman himself claimed self-defense. He told anyone who would listen that he feared Hardin, that the gunman had threatened him, and that he fired because he believed his life was at risk. That claim played well in front of jurors, who knew Hardin's bloody record and had no trouble believing he might shoot first. Yet Selman had reasons to shade the story. He faced charges for murder, and only a convincing story of fear could clear him. When the man left alive tells his version, he always has more to gain. So we are left with two anchors. On one side is the physical evidence, a bullet wound to the back of the skull, consistent with a man shot from behind while unaware. On the other side is the single testimony of a mirror reflection, suggesting Hardin saw Selman coming and moved for his gun. Between those 2 points lies the uncertainty of human memory and motive. To imagine that moment, picture the scene. The saloon was filled with smoke and noise. Lamps glared off the big wall mirror. Hardin's eyes were on the dice in his hand, his hat pulled low over his brow. Selman stepped in through the door and angled toward the bar. In just a stride or two, he was behind Hardin. It would have taken only a second to raise the pistol and fire. Would Hardin really have noticed the movement in a mirror, processed it, turned his body, and drawn a pistol in that tiny span? The logic of timing is against it, though not impossible. That is why the story refuses to die. Crowd reaction added more confusion. Some witnesses swore they heard no words exchanged. Others later claimed Selman gave a warning or challenged Hardin before firing. But saloons swallowed words, and in the moment of a gunshot, few ears registered what was said. It is safer to admit that we do not know. What we do know is that the first bullet dropped Hardin instantly, and whatever followed was secondary. So was it murder or was it defense? The medical record leans strongly toward murder by ambush, while the mirror tale offered Selman the shield of self-defense. The weight of evidence is on one side, yet the legend of Hardin was strong enough to keep doubt alive. Men wanted to believe he died facing a gun, not crouched over dice, because that suited the myth of the gunfighter better. Even in death, Hardin shaped his own story. This is where we must leave the question open, for now. We know Selman fired the first shot, and we know it entered the back of Hardin's head. We also know that at least one man swore Hardin was turning to draw. Which version convinces you depends on how much faith you place in memory versus physical proof. Later in this investigation, we will map the saloon, trace the bullet, and test the timing. Those steps will not remove all doubt, but they will tell us how likely each story really is. Part 2. Scene reconstruction, layout, and timing. To understand how John Wesley Hardin fell in the Acme Saloon, we must first rebuild the room where he spent his last minutes. Eyewitness accounts lose clarity under pressure, but the layout of the saloon, the placement of its furniture, and the distance a man could cover in 2 steps provide a more stable frame. Once we see the scene in its physical detail, we can judge whether Selman's shot was the act of an assassin slipping up behind a distracted gambler or a desperate response to a man who was already turning with a gun. The Acme Saloon stood on San Antonio Street in El Paso, a long, narrow room like many frontier bars. The front door opened straight onto the main floor, with the bar running down one side and a wall mirror mounted behind it. On the other side of the room, tables were crowded together for cards, dice, and drinking. At the back stood a partitioned area and another exit. Oil lamps lit the bar and mirror, but left shadows in the corners. The smell of whiskey and cigars mixed with the sweat of a packed night crowd. That mirror was no ordinary decoration. In Western saloons, a large mirror served both practical and symbolic purposes. It made the space look bigger, gave gamblers a sense of watching their backs, and reflected the movement of anyone coming through the door. The mirror in the Acme stretched wide, large enough for a man standing at the bar to catch shapes behind him, provided the angle and light cooperated. It was into this mirror, witnesses said, that Hardin may have glimpsed Selman's entry. Whether the reflection was clear or broken by glare is one of the most important questions in this entire case. Now let us place the players. Hardin stood at the bar, a few feet from the door. He leaned forward, engaged in a dice game, his right hand free and his revolver resting in a holster at his hip. His back was angled toward the entrance, meaning his head and shoulders were exposed to anyone stepping in. He was not facing the door. He was not squared for a fight. He was in the stance of a man at ease, absorbed in the fall of dice. Selman entered through the front door. Accounts differ on whether he paused or moved directly toward Hardin, but all agree his approach was swift. The distance from the door to where Hardin stood was only a handful of steps. Even at a normal pace, Selman could have crossed it in 2 seconds. A brisk stride cut that time in half. The geometry of the room gave Selman a straight line to Hardin's back, without obstruction from furniture or crowd. For a man intent on ambush, the room offered a perfect approach. What about the other patrons? Several gamblers and drinkers were nearby, some at the bar and others at tables. Their presence mattered less for blocking Selman than for shaping later testimony. A man sitting at a table on the far side of the room saw only angles and shadows. A man beside the dice table saw the action more clearly. Each witness remembered according to his position. This explains why some later claimed Hardin turned, while others insisted he never moved. The scene itself was split into vantage points, and memory followed those lines. Timing is the key. From Selman's entry to his shot, we are looking at no more than 2 or 3 seconds. Could Hardin have seen his reflection, processed the threat, turned his body, and reached for his revolver in that span? In theory, yes. But consider the mechanics. A quarter turn of the body costs a half second. Drawing a revolver under stress costs another. Recognition of a moving figure in a smoky mirror adds its own delay. A man might accomplish it, but only if he were already primed for danger. Hardin, distracted by dice and conversation, may not have been ready. That is why the timing favors the ambush version, though it does not rule out the other entirely. The mirror still leaves room for doubt. Depending on the angle of Hardin's stance, the height of the lamps, and the brightness of the glass, he may have had a line of sight. If so, he could have noticed Selman's reflection just as the constable raised his gun. But a glance is not the same as a full turn. Hardin could have been struck while beginning to move, creating the impression for one witness that he was drawing, when in reality, he never had the chance. The bar itself shaped the moment. Hardin leaned against it, with one side of his body pinned by the wooden edge. That position slowed his ability to pivot. A gambler at a table could rise and turn freely, but a man boxed against a bar always needed an extra instant to adjust. That extra instant can mean life or death when the other man has already cleared leather. The crowd in the saloon reacted in predictable fashion once the gun fired. Some patrons ducked under tables, others bolted for the door, and a few froze. The confusion created gaps in observation. Many witnesses admitted later that they did not clearly see Selman's hand rise or Hardin's hand move. What they did see, clearly, was the smoke and the body on the floor. From that single clear fact, people filled in the missing parts according to their own assumptions about who Hardin was and what he deserved. When we step back and view the scene as a whole, several truths emerge. The layout gave Selman the advantage. He entered behind Hardin, with a direct line of approach. The distance was so short that Hardin had little time to react. The mirror provided only a narrow chance of warning, and even then, his stance against the bar limited his movement. These factors suggest that the room itself favored the account of an ambush. Yet the possibility of a reflection remains, leaving just enough room for the story of a quick reaction to survive. This reconstruction is important because it gives us the framework for the rest of the investigation. Every claim about whether Hardin turned, whether he reached for his pistol, or whether Selman acted in fear depends on this map of the acme. Without the layout, the stories float free. With the layout, we can test each against time, distance, and human ability. Later in this video, we will move from the stage to the weapons. We will look closely at what Selman carried, what Hardin carried, and what kind of ammunition was in play. We will also study the single recovered bullet and see how it measures against the likely candidates. Only then can we match the room we have drawn here with the physical evidence left behind. Part 3. Weapons and the death scene bullet. When shots ring out, the weapons in hand often tell as much of the story as the men who wield them. In the case of John Wesley Hardin's death inside the Acme Saloon, 2 pistols faced each other in history. The revolver of Constable John Selman and the personal sidearm of Hardin. Each had its own design, caliber, and loading, and both left marks on the record. Alongside these weapons sits one more piece of evidence that has been debated for over a century: the bullet recovered from the scene. That small fragment of lead has been studied, weighed, and measured in hopes of answering whether Selman's shot was the execution of a helpless gambler or the only way to stop a deadly draw. Selman was known to carry a Colt single-action army, the classic revolver of the frontier. This pistol was chambered in several calibers, but the .45 Colt was by far the most common and popular among lawmen and cowboys alike. The Colt had a heavy frame, a long barrel, and the stopping power needed for close-quarters encounters. Its cylinder held 6 rounds, although many shooters of the time kept only 5 loaded to avoid an accidental discharge if the hammer was struck. In 1895, the Colt was already a weapon with decades of service and a reputation as the equalizer of the West. Hardin's choice of pistol was different. He carried a Smith & Wesson double-action revolver, likely chambered in .44 or .38 caliber, depending on the exact model. Smith & Wesson had pioneered the double-action design, which allowed a faster firing cycle since the shooter could fire with each pull of the trigger without cocking the hammer separately. For a gunfighter who prided himself on speed, this was an advantage. Hardin was known to practice with his pistol daily, and friends claimed he could draw and fire in less than a second. Whether the pistol was truly in his hand when Selman's shot struck is another matter. Understanding the difference between these two weapons matters because the bullet found at the scene had to come from one or the other. Early reports described a single bullet retrieved from Hardin's body. Later forensic review of this piece, conducted more than a century after the shooting, has given us new numbers to work with. The bullet was measured for weight, diameter, and deformation, and compared to the expected characteristics of .45 Colt and .44 or .38 Smith & Wesson rounds. The recovered bullet weighed in around 230 grains, with a diameter close to .45 inches. That measurement points strongly toward the .45 Colt, the round most associated with Selman's revolver. The .45 Colt was a large, heavy cartridge designed for stopping power at close range. A bullet of that weight and size would match Selman's weapon perfectly, while being unlikely to match Hardin's smaller caliber pistol. In other words, the physical evidence places the fatal shot in Selman's hand, which aligns with every eyewitness who claimed Hardin never got a shot off. Yet the bullet also tells a subtler story. Its surface showed signs of flattening and deformation, which meant it struck hard bone before coming to rest. That fits the doctor's testimony that the shot entered the back of Hardin's skull. What it does not do is prove direction beyond what the wound already indicated. Forensic science in 1895 was too crude to measure rifling marks or to perform the kind of ballistic fingerprinting common today. The lead was examined by eye and later by scale, but never with microscopes capable of matching it to the grooves of Selman's barrel. Modern researchers tried to compensate for that by reconstructing likely trajectories and examining what the bullet's weight loss meant. Their conclusion was that the round was almost certainly a .45 Colt slug, fired from Selman's Colt revolver at close range. This conclusion reinforces the medical finding and undermines the mirror and turn testimony. If Hardin had managed to spin and begin a draw, the entry wound and bullet characteristics would be far harder to explain. Another angle worth considering is the rate of fire. Hardin's Smith & Wesson, with its double-action system, gave him the theoretical advantage of speed if both men had drawn simultaneously. Selman's Colt required cocking the hammer for each shot, though many shooters had mastered the art of fanning or rapid cocking. In a fair duel, Hardin's pistol might have allowed him to win. But the fact that no bullet from Hardin's revolver was fired suggests he never cleared his holster, and that timing removes any benefit his weapon might have offered. The recovered bullet is often called the death scene bullet because it is the one solid piece of material evidence from the killing. Without it, the debate would rest entirely on words. Words from Selman defending himself, words from Anderson claiming Hardin turned, words from newspapers painting Hardin as doomed from the start. The bullet adds weight to one side of the argument. It tells us that the weapon which fired the fatal shot was almost certainly Selman's Colt, not Hardin's Smith & Wesson. It also tells us that the distance was close and the angle from behind. Still, we must note the limits. Forensics cannot tell us what passed in Selman's mind. It cannot tell us whether he intended to ambush a hated gunman or whether he truly believed Hardin was about to shoot. The bullet is silent on motive. It speaks only of caliber, angle, and impact. The rest must be drawn from the human record. This much is sure. The guns of that night mattered, and the bullet left behind confirmed which one ended the legend of John Wesley Hardin. A Colt revolver, firing a heavy .45 slug, carried by an aging constable, delivered the fatal blow. The Smith & Wesson never spoke. Whether that silence was because Hardin was caught unaware or because he simply lost a race to the draw remains the central divide. Later in this video, we will use this knowledge to study the path the bullet took once fired. The layout of the Acme Saloon, combined with the caliber and power of the .45 Colt, allows us to reconstruct the trajectory. By comparing that path with the position of Hardin's body and the testimony of witnesses, we can test once and for all whether the mirror story holds any ground. Part 4. Trajectory and Wound Path Analysis. By now we know the key players, the room they stood in, and the weapons they carried. We also know that one bullet recovered from the scene matched the caliber of Selman's Colt revolver. Yet that alone does not end the argument. To close the gap between ambush and self-defense, we must turn to the path of the fatal shot. Where it entered, how it traveled, and where it came to rest provide the most direct test of the competing stories. Trajectory and wound path analysis cannot speak to motives, but it can speak to physics, and physics is harder to bend than testimony. The medical testimony from August 19, 1895, was clear. Hardin was struck in the back of the head. The bullet entered near the base of the skull, shattered bone, and lodged within. Death was instantaneous. That entry point has always been the cornerstone of the ambush argument. If Hardin had been turning to meet Selman, as Shorty Anderson claimed, the wound should have been on the side of the head or in the face. Instead, the round went in directly from behind. This is why so many early accounts treated the killing as a shot in the back, pure and simple. But there are layers here. A man in the act of turning may still present the back of his head if the turn was only beginning. A slight twist of the shoulders could leave the skull exposed at an angle that still produced a rear entry wound. This possibility kept the mirror and turn story alive. It allowed believers to argue that Hardin saw the danger, began to move, and was caught mid-turn. Thus, the wound is not definitive on its own, but it is heavily weighted toward one explanation. The position of the body at the moment of impact must also be considered. Hardin was leaning slightly forward over the dice game. His head was bent down, tilted toward the table. That posture exposed more of the back of the skull than if he had been standing upright. In effect, it made him more vulnerable to a shot from behind and increased the odds that such a shot would strike cleanly without needing to angle upward or downward. The detail of his stance supports the idea that Selman's bullet came straight in as Hardin played. Trajectory through the room also matters. Witnesses agreed that Selman stood directly behind Hardin when he fired. If Selman had approached from a sharper angle, say from the side of the bar, we might expect a wound on the side of the head. But standing in line with the back of Hardin's hat, the shot had nowhere else to land but the rear of the skull. The geometry of the room and the placement of the men line up with the medical finding. The recovered bullet showed heavy deformation, meaning it struck hard bone before coming to rest. This matches perfectly with the skull impact. It also means the round's energy was spent quickly, leaving little chance for an exit wound. The stopping power of the .45 Colt round was designed for close-range encounters, and here it did exactly what it was built to do: penetrate deeply and stay lodged. Now consider the timing. For Hardin to have been turning, he would have needed to recognize Selman in the mirror, process the threat, and begin a physical rotation. The entire sequence might take 1 to 2 seconds at minimum. Selman, on the other hand, needed only to raise his pistol and fire. With the distance being no more than a few feet, his task was faster. Physics alone suggests that even if Hardin had begun to turn, he would never have completed the motion before the bullet struck. This explains how Anderson could have believed Hardin was moving, while the wound shows otherwise. The eye can mistake the start of a flinch or tilt for a deliberate turn. Another piece to weigh is the direction of the bullet's travel inside the skull. Reports indicated it moved forward after entry, consistent with a shot fired from behind at close range. There is no evidence of an upward or downward angle, which means Selman's pistol was at roughly the same height as Hardin's head. That further supports the idea that Selman stood directly behind him, close enough that no complex angle was involved. If Hardin had been rising, turning, or leaning away, the angle might have been sharper. Instead, the path is almost straight in. Critics of the ambush theory sometimes point to the possibility of ricochet or deflection, claiming that mirrors, bottles, or bar fixtures could have altered the bullet's path. But the condition of the recovered slug argues against this. A bullet that ricochets shows irregular flattening, while this one showed clean deformation from bone impact. Nothing in its markings suggested a prior strike against glass or wood. In other words, the bullet did not bounce. It went directly from pistol to skull. When the wound, the bullet, and the layout are taken together, a consistent picture forms. Selman approached from behind, raised his Colt, and fired into the back of Hardin's head at close range. The trajectory is too clean, the wound too square, and the bullet too intact to allow for a side angle or ricochet. While it remains possible that Hardin had begun to stir, the evidence shows he did not have the time to complete a turn or draw his revolver. What does this mean for the broader debate? It reinforces the ambush interpretation but leaves just enough space for the defenders of Selman's version. Physics cannot entirely disprove a partial turn or a twitch toward a weapon. Yet the odds lean heavily one way. A man bent over dice with his back to the door is unlikely to beat another man already aiming from behind. The wound path analysis also silences one other question. Could Hardin have been shot from the front in a fair draw? The answer is no. The angle, the entry point, and the deformation all make that impossible. Hardin never faced Selman squarely in those last seconds. So, was the shot an act of self-defense or an ambush? The science of trajectory points clearly toward the latter. The bullet traveled exactly as one would expect from a man firing into the back of another's head at close range. Whatever movement Hardin may have made was too little, too late. Later in this video, we will move to the final layer of the case: how the killing was framed in testimony, at the coroner's inquest, and in court. The physical evidence may favor one story, but the legal arguments gave jurors a very different choice. In that arena, memory, reputation, and public opinion weighed just as much as lead and bone. Part 5. Reassessment in 2025, Scholarship and Local Reporting. 130 years have passed since John Wesley Hardin's death in the Acme Saloon, yet the single shot that ended him still provokes argument. For decades, the story wavered between two images: Hardin gunned down from behind in cold blood, or Hardin catching sight of his killer in the mirror and reaching for his pistol in a final duel. In recent years, however, new scholarship and local reporting have stripped away layers of myth. At the heart of this reassessment stands the article by James P. Bailey and William A. Spear, published in the Wild West History Association Journal. Their work is now the foundation on which modern understanding of the case rests today. Bailey and Spear set out to examine the one piece of physical evidence that still survives in the record, the so-called death scene bullet. Using careful measurements, they recorded its weight at approximately 230 grains and its diameter at close to 0.45 inches. These numbers were decisive. A bullet of that size could only have been fired from a .45 Colt, the round used in John Selman's Colt single-action Army revolver. Hardin's Smith & Wesson double-action, likely chambered in .38 or .44, could not have fired it. With this, Bailey and Spear confirmed what earlier suspicion suggested. The fatal shot came from Selman's weapon, not Hardin's. They did more than weigh the bullet. They studied its condition, noting the heavy flattening and deformation along one side. That pattern, they explained, was consistent with a direct strike on bone, not with a ricochet from glass, wood, or metal. In other words, the bullet traveled cleanly from Selman's pistol into the back of Hardin's skull without striking any object in between. This finding dealt a severe blow to the old claim that a deflection or odd angle might explain away the wound. The bullet's shape told the story of a straight, direct shot. Bailey and Spear also reconstructed the interior of the Acme Saloon using period diagrams and eyewitness descriptions. They mapped the placement of the bar, the long mirror, the dice table, and the front door. Their reconstruction showed how short the distance was between Selman's entry and Hardin's position. A man could cover it in 1 or 2 seconds. From behind, Selman would have had a clear and unobstructed line of fire into the back of Hardin's head. The mirror, often invoked in Anderson's testimony, offered only a slim chance of reflection at the right angle. Smoke, glare from oil lamps, and the angle of Hardin's stance made it unlikely he ever saw Selman's approach. The authors compared this reconstruction with the wound path. Doctors in 1895 had testified that the bullet entered the back of Hardin's head at the base of the skull. Bailey and Spear showed how this matched perfectly with Selman's position in their diagram. Had Hardin been turning, the wound should have been at the side or the face. Instead, the trajectory pointed directly to an ambush shot from behind. Their conclusion was plain. The physical evidence overwhelmingly supports a rear-entry wound consistent with Selman firing from behind at close range. What Bailey and Spear also made clear is that the legal proceedings of 1895 did not rest on such forensic reasoning. At Selman's trial, the argument of self-defense was built largely on Hardin's reputation as a dangerous killer. Jurors were asked to believe that Selman acted to protect himself, and many found that believable because they already feared Hardin's name. Bailey and Spear emphasized this gap between the courtroom and the evidence. The bullet, the wound, and the room layout all pointed toward an ambush, but the law of the time cared more about reputation and public feeling than scientific proof. In El Paso itself, modern reporters have revisited this divide. Local articles in recent years have drawn on Bailey and Spear's research to remind readers that the myth of Hardin's final duel was never supported by the evidence. They show how quickly newspapers in 1895 began shaping the story into whatever version sold best. Some papers printed the ambush version, others hinted at a duel, but all agreed the city was relieved to see Hardin gone. That relief, more than fact, drove public opinion. By 2025, the reassessment of Hardin's death rests firmly on the shoulders of Bailey and Spear's study. Their measurements of the bullet, their analysis of its deformation, and their reconstruction of the saloon's interior leave little doubt about what happened physically. Hardin was shot from behind in the back of the head by a .45 Colt round fired from Selman's revolver. He did not fire his own pistol. He almost certainly never completed a turn toward his attacker. What remains unsettled is Selman's intent. Did he plan the killing as a cold ambush, or did he fire in genuine fear when he saw the gunman shift at the bar? Bailey and Spear acknowledged that motive cannot be drawn from the bullet itself. Modern reporting has echoed this, stressing that while the physical record is clear, the state of Selman's mind is forever beyond reach. The value of their work lies in its precision. By stripping away rumor and testing claims against measurable evidence, Bailey and Spear narrowed the story to what can be known. They did not claim to solve every question, but they left no doubt about the trajectory, the caliber, and the impossibility of a front-facing duel. In doing so, they reshaped the discussion from one of endless speculation to one anchored in fact. So, where does that leave us in 2025? The legend of Hardin still lingers, fueled by those who prefer to imagine him dying with his pistol half drawn. But Bailey and Spear's study has made it impossible to ignore the hard evidence. The man was struck from behind while bent over a dice game. His gun stayed holstered. The frontier's most notorious killer did not meet his end in a fair draw, but in a single shot from behind. That conclusion may not fit the myth, but it fits the record.